You are nothing but a charity case. This firm is too polite to throw out. Nobody in the room breathed. The intern standing at the head of the conference table did not flinch, did not blink, did not look away from the man who had just said it. He simply set his laptop down on the table, screen still glowing, with numbers nobody else wanted to see, and waited for the sentence to finish landing. People like you get handed opportunities. The rest of us had to earn, the man continued, straightening his cufflinks as if the insult required grooming. Be grateful I haven't called security already. I am trying to do the job you assigned me, the young man said, voice level, almost gentle. That means telling you when the numbers are wrong. Respect is earned, not given because you show up. The man's smile had the polish of someone who had said cruel things in boardrooms his entire career and never once been made to answer for it. And right now you've earned nothing but a box to carry your things out in. If that's really your decision, you've already made it. Gladly. He pointed toward the elevator bank at the end of the glass corridor. Pack up before you humiliate yourself in front of the whole floor again. The young man closed his laptop, tucked it under arm, and picked up a small cardboard box that someone from facilities had already, almost gleefully, prepared for him. He walked toward the elevators without arguing, without raising his voice, without giving the man at the head of the table the satisfaction of a scene. The executive watched him go with the particular smugness of someone who believes he has won. He had no idea. The 19-year-old he had just thrown out of Halstead Meridian Group controlled the $180 million keeping the company's lights on. 9 hours earlier, the sun had barely cleared the skyline over downtown Charlotte, throwing long amber light across the 41st floor of the Halstead Meridian Group Tower on South Tryon Street. Devon Ashworth was already at his desk at 6:52 in the morning, 3 cups of burnt break room, coffee deep, cross-referencing spreadsheets nobody had asked him to touch. His fingers moved fast across the keyboard, pulling headcount records from 4 different departments and lining them up against a master file that didn't want to agree with itself. The open floor around him hummed with the low static of people getting ready for something big. Grant Halloway, founder and chief executive of Halstead Meridian, had scheduled the most important board presentation of the fiscal year for 10 o'clock. Everyone on the analytics team had been asked to help polish it. Nobody had asked Devon. He had shown up anyway because that was who he was, and because something in the retention numbers had been bothering him since Tuesday like a splinter he couldn't dig out. Priya Nadella sat 2 seats down, reviewing quarterly slides on her tablet, throwing occasional glances at the 22-year-old intern, hunched over his laptop like he was diffusing something. "How's the retention breakdown coming?" she asked, not really expecting an answer that mattered. Devon didn't look up right away. Something doesn't add up. He pulled a second file, a headcount snapshot from 90 days earlier, and set it beside the current roster. Priya leaned in, more out of habit than curiosity, and studied the 2 columns he'd built, one for departures, one for new hires, one for the final retention percentage the board would see at 10 sharp. The number on the polished slide read 91%, healthy, reassuring. Exactly the kind of number that made nervous investors sign checks. "That number's clean," Priya said. Then she noticed the second window open behind it, a list scrolling slower, denser, older. "What's that one?" "Termination records, last quarter." Devon's voice dropped, the way it did when he was doing math he didn't want to be doing. 51 people, warehouse, customer service, data entry. All of it filed under something called workforce optimization. Priya scanned the names. She recognized at least 6 of them. People she'd said good morning to in the elevator for 2 years. Quietly let go under language, soft enough to mean nothing and everything at once. Devon pulled the retention formula back onto the screen and, this time, folded the 51 terminations back into it. If you count everyone who actually left this company in the last 90 days, he said, the real number isn't 91%. It's 74, 17 points. Priya felt the number settle into her stomach like a stone dropped in still water. That's not a rounding error, Devon. That's a different story. It's the true story, he said. The board is about to hear the fake one in 3 hours. Priya glanced toward the far end of the conference room floor, where Grant Halloway's chief financial officer, Marcus Doyle, sat reviewing investor projections with the calm of a man who had never once had to explain a bad number to anyone. Grant's executive assistant was arranging printed decks near the podium, squaring the corners obsessively. Everyone on that floor believed the day was going to go exactly as planned. You need to flag this to someone, Priya said quietly. I'm flagging it to you. You're my supervisor. Grant signed off on these numbers yesterday himself. Then he signed off on an incomplete picture, Devon said, and there was no heat in it, only the flat certainty of someone reading a fact off a page. Priya, if my name is anywhere near this presentation and I know the number is wrong, I can't let it go out like this. That's not a version of my job I'm willing to do. Priya understood the math. She also understood, with the particular clarity of someone 11 years into a career built on not rocking boats, exactly how dangerous it was for a 22-year-old summer intern to challenge a number Grant Halloway had already put his name on. Let me think about how to bring this to him the right way. There's nothing to think through. Devon saved the corrected file under a new name, careful, unhurried. The board needs the real number before 10 o'clock. Not after. That was when Grant's voice rolled across the open floor, carrying the particular confidence of a man who had built a 140-employee logistics and fulfillment company from a garage in Gastonia into a name investors recognized. Priya, tell me those retention figures are locked. Grant crossed the floor in an unhurried line, his tailored navy suit catching the morning light. Marcus Doyle trailing a half step behind, with a tablet pressed to his chest like a shield. Priya felt her pulse tick up before she'd even decided what to say. We're finishing the final review now, she said carefully. Grant stopped beside Devon's chair and glanced down at the laptop screen, still open to the corrected file. Good. The board needs to walk out of that room, believing this company weathered the restructuring without breaking a sweat. 91% retention says exactly that. Devon looked up at him, unhurried, unbothered. Actually, sir, I found a discrepancy in the calculation. The floor around them went quiet in that specific, electric way. Open offices go quiet when everyone is pretending not to listen. Grant's easy smile stiffened by exactly 1 degree, the kind of shift only someone watching closely would catch. A discrepancy, Grant repeated. The retention number on the deck excludes everyone terminated. In the last quarter, Devon said, still calm, still even. When you count all departures, including the 51 people let go under workforce optimization, the real retention rate is 74%. Grant stared down at him the way a man stares at a fire alarm going off during a wedding toast. I approved those figures myself. Yesterday. Yes, sir, but they weren't complete when you approved them. Marcus stepped closer, curiosity briefly winning out over caution. What data are we talking about? Devon turned the laptop so both men could see it clearly. 51 employee terminations that never made it into the retention math. Most of them entry-level. Warehouse floor, call center, data processing. Priya watched Marcus's eyes move across the numbers, watched the half-second flicker of a man realizing an intern was right, followed instantly by the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned exactly how much his own opinion was worth in this room. Grant's jaw tightened. Those separations were part of a planned restructuring, Grant said. They don't belong in a retention metric that's meant to show operational stability. They belong in any number that claims to measure how many people actually stayed, Devon said. This one doesn't do that. Does something else. and calls it that anyway. The floor had gone fully silent now. 36 people, pretending very hard to be absorbed in their own screens while listening to every word. Grant's voice hardened into something with an edge in it. Your job is to prepare the materials I request, not to rewrite them an hour before I walk into a board meeting. My job is to make sure the materials I prepare are true, Devon said, meeting his stare without moving. I can't put my name on a number I know is wrong. Marcus cleared his throat, glancing between the two of them, with the discomfort of a man watching a car crash he could still, technically, prevent. Grant's face had gone a shade darker. The board is in 3 hours, Grant said. I need the retention analysis, exactly as I approved it. I won't knowingly prepare something misleading for a board of directors, Devon said. Quiet, unshaken, and somehow that quiet was worse than if he'd shouted it. Something in Grant's expression cracked open. The CEO who commanded boardrooms and terrified competitors for a living was being told no, calmly, by a 19-year-old wearing a thrift store blazer over a company polo. Then you don't work here, Grant snapped and turned toward the corridor. Get someone from HR up here right now. That was the moment everyone on the 41st floor would replay for months afterward. The moment Grant Halloway fired the intern, who refused to help him lie to his own board. Devon didn't argue. He closed the laptop, gathered the file he'd corrected, and waited while a facilities coordinator, moving with suspicious speed, produced an empty cardboard box as if she'd had it ready under her desk the entire time. Nobody said anything. Priya's hands stayed frozen on her tablet. Marcus studied the carpet like it had personally wronged him. And that brings us back to the corridor, the elevator bank, the smug curl at the corner of Grant Halloway's mouth as he watched a teenager carry a cardboard box toward the elevators without a single word of protest. Grant believed, in that moment, that he had won something. He had no idea what he had actually done. To understand why, you have to go back further than that morning. Back 9 months, to a small brick duplex on the west side of Winston-Salem, where a woman named Odessa Ashworth spent 31 years working the floor of a textile plant that folded 3 times under 3 different owners before finally closing for good. Odessa raised her grandson, Devon, alone after his mother passed when he was 6, working double shifts and coming home smelling like machine oil and instant coffee, telling him the same thing every night before bed. Baby, the day somebody tells you your voice doesn't matter, that's the day you find out exactly how much it does. Devon carried that sentence with him, the way other people carry a lucky coin. He kept his grandmother's old employee badge from the plant, laminated, cracked at one corner, her photograph faded to the color of weak tea, clipped inside his backpack every single day, including the day Grant Halloway fired him. It wasn't sentiment exactly. It was a reminder. Odessa had spent 3 decades being told her work didn't count for much, right up until the day the plant closed, and nobody in management could explain. Without her handwritten logs, how half the machines even operated. Nobody at Halstead Meridian knew that Devon's late grandfather, Odessa's husband, had been a floor supervisor named Willis Ashworth, and that Willis's older brother, a quiet, meticulous man named Reginald Ashworth, had spent 40 years building a logistics holding company from nothing into something worth watching. Reginald had passed 2 years earlier, with no children of his own, and had left the bulk of his estate, including a controlling investment vehicle called Piedmont Bridge Capital, to his only living relative who'd ever visited him more than once a year. That relative was Devon. Devon had never touched the money beyond what his accountant insisted he sign. He had asked, specifically, that Piedmont Bridge's ownership stake in Halstead Meridian Group, the $180 million recapitalization that had kept the company solvent after a disastrous supply chain contract 2 years prior, remain structured through a blind holding entity. He hadn't wanted a title. He hadn't wanted a corner office. He had wanted, quietly, to understand what kind of company his great-uncle's money was actually propping up, from the inside, before deciding what to do about it. So he applied for the summer internship program under his own name, in a stack of 400 applications. And nobody in HR had thought to run anything more than a basic background check on a data entry intern. That was the secret Grant Halloway didn't know when he pointed toward the elevators. That was the box. Devon carried down 41 floors without a single word of protest, because arguing would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant revealing his hand 3 hours before he was ready to. Priya found him in the lobby 20 minutes later, still sitting on a marble bench near the security desk, laptop bag across his knees. Looking less like a man who'd just been humiliated, and more like a man doing arithmetic in his head. "You should have let me handle it," she said, sitting down beside him, voice tight with something between anger and guilt. "You did what you could," Devon said. "You checked my math twice before he even walked over. That's not the same as standing up for you in the room." "No," Devon agreed. "It's not." He wasn't angry with her. That was the part that unsettled Priya most. The total absence of bitterness in his voice, like he'd already filed the morning away under something he'd expected all along. She watched him pull out his phone and type a short message, thumbs unhurried, before slipping it back into his pocket. "What was that?" she asked. "A phone call I need to make." Devon stood, slung the laptop bag over his shoulder, and picked up the cardboard box. "Priya, thank you for checking the numbers with me. Whatever happens today, that mattered." He walked out through the revolving doors onto South Tryon Street, into the kind of bright, indifferent morning that doesn't care what just happened to you. And he made one phone call. It lasted 4 minutes. On the other end was a woman named Corinne Alvarez, managing director of Piedmont Bridge Capital, the person who had quietly run Devon's uncle's investment vehicle for the last 11 years, and who had been waiting, with visible patience, for Devon to finally say the words she'd been expecting since the day he took the internship. "Say the word," Corinne told him, "and this is over by Friday." "Not over," Devon said. "Just corrected. I want to see how deep this actually goes before we do anything permanent." Inside the tower he'd just been marched out of, the board presentation went ahead, exactly as scheduled at 10 o'clock, exactly as Grant Halloway wanted it, with the 91% Trichin figure glowing on the projector, board members, in front of 6 board members and 2 representatives from Piedmont Bridge Capital, who sat quietly at the far end of the table, said almost nothing, and took very careful notes. Grant didn't recognize either of them. He had no reason to. Piedmont Bridge had always sent different faces to different meetings, per its own long-standing policy, and Grant had never once asked who was actually behind the fund keeping his company alive. That was the first mistake. It would not be his last. For 3 days after the firing, life at Halstead Meridian Group continued with the particular, uneasy normalcy of an office that has decided not to talk about something. Priya kept her head down, reviewing numbers she now trusted a great deal less than she used to. Marcus Doyle avoided eye contact with anyone who'd been in the room that morning. And in HR, a woman named Bernice Calloway, Halstead Meridian's chief people officer, sharp-suited and permanently unbothered, quietly opened Devon Ashworth's personnel file and began typing. She added a line dated 3 weeks prior, a fabricated write-up describing a verbal altercation with a supervisor that had never happened, and backdated it with a keystroke that took less than 4 seconds. It was the kind of small, tidy lie that made an unjust firing look procedurally clean on paper. The kind of lie that had worked for Bernice a half-dozen times before, on employees with far less reason to ever look back. She had no idea. The system logged every edit, with a timestamp nobody could erase. On the 4th day, at 9:14 in the morning, an email arrived in Grant Halloway's inbox from an address he didn't recognize. Legal at Piedmont Bridge. Calm. The subject line read, simply, formal notice, governance review, Halstead Meridian Group. Grant almost deleted it as spam. Something made him open it instead. The letter was 3 paragraphs long, unsigned by name, citing section provisions from the original recapitalization agreement Grant had personally negotiated and signed 2 years earlier. Provisions granting Piedmont Bridge Capital the right to trigger an independent governance review under specific conditions, including credible evidence of material misrepresentation to the board of directors. The letter requested full access to termination records, retention calculations, and internal communications from the past 90 days, effective immediately. Grant read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus Doyle into his office, closing the glass door behind him with more force than necessary. "What is this?" Grant said, sliding the printed email across his desk. Marcus read it, and something in his face went carefully, deliberately blank, the specific blankness of a man calculating how much he was personally exposed. "It's Piedmont Bridge. They're invoking the governance clause. Over what? A rounding disagreement with an intern? Grant." Marcus set the paper down slowly. If they're pulling that clause, they already know something. They wouldn't move on a hunch. Piedmont Bridge doesn't do anything on a hunch. Grant stood at the window, looking down at the traffic crawling along South Tryon Street, 41 floors below, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that resembled the beginning of fear. He did not yet connect it to the teenager he had marched out of the building 4 days earlier. That connection was still 3 weeks away, and it would arrive in the worst possible way. The governance review moved fast, faster than Grant had believed. Any external process could move inside a company he still technically controlled the majority voting shares of. Rebecca Winslow, an independent auditor Piedmont Bridge retained specifically for situations like this one, arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 associates and a court-authorized data preservation order that made Bernice Calloway's face go the color of old paper. Rebecca was 53, precise, in a way that made people nervous without her raising her voice, and she had spent 19 years dismantling exactly this kind of corporate rot. The kind built quietly, over years, by people who believed their own confidence was a form of evidence. She set up in a small conference room on the 39th floor, pulled server logs, interviewed employees one at a time behind a closed door, and said almost nothing to anyone about what she was finding. What she was finding was worse than Devon had expected. The 51 terminations from the previous quarter were only the beginning. Rebecca's team traced a pattern going back nearly 3 years. Waves of layoffs disproportionately concentrated among entry-level Black and Latino employees in warehouse operations and customer service. Each wave carefully excluded from whatever metric the board happened to be reviewing that quarter. Severance agreements included unusually aggressive, non-disparagement clauses. Exit interviews, when they existed at all, were conducted by Bernice personally and were suspiciously uniform in their language, as though someone had handed departing employees a script and asked them to read it under duress. Priya was interviewed on the 2nd day. She told Rebecca everything: the retention numbers, the correction Devon had made, the exact words Grant had used when he fired him. Her hands shook the entire time. She kept waiting for the moment Rebecca would tell her she was in trouble too, for staying quiet as long as she had. That moment never came. Instead, Rebecca simply thanked her, made a note, and asked one more question before letting her go. "Do you know where Mr. Ashworth's personnel file currently stands? Has anything been added to it since his termination?" Priya didn't know, but the question sat in her chest like a lit match for the rest of the day. On the 3rd day of the review, Grant did something that would later be read back to him, word for word, in a room he could not walk out of. He called an emergency session of the 4-person board he had personally appointed over the years. men and women who owed their seats, directly or indirectly, to Grant's recommendation, and pushed through a resolution removing the two independent board members who had voted to cooperate fully with Rebecca's request for documents. He replaced them that same afternoon with two executives who reported directly to him. It was legal, in the narrowest possible reading of the bylaws. It was also, as Rebecca noted flatly in her preliminary report 2 days later, a textbook act of obstruction consistent with consciousness of wrongdoing. And it was the single worst decision Grant made in the entire ordeal, because it was the moment Piedmont Bridge matter and started treating it as a host governance matter, requiring a full recapitalization trigger. Fichem offers. Devon read that section of the report from a laptop in his grandmother's kitchen in Winston-Salem, Odessa moving around behind him, making dinner, humming something low under her breath the way she always did when she was worried, and didn't want him to see it. He read the paragraph about the removed board members twice, then set the laptop down, not slammed. Just set down, quietly, the way you set down something that finally confirms what you already suspected. They didn't just fire me for asking a question, he said, mostly to himself. They've been doing this for years. I was just the first one with $180 million behind me. Odessa turned from the stove, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and looked at her grandson for a long moment. You gonna do something about it, or you gonna sit there reading it like homework? I'm doing something about it, Devon said. I'm doing it the way that actually holds. 2 weeks later, the recapitalization trigger activated, under the exact provisions Grant had signed 2 years earlier, provisions his own lawyers had drafted, provisions he'd barely read past the signature line, because he'd needed that $180 million to keep Halstead Meridian afloat after a disastrous fulfillment contract nearly sank the company. Voting control of the board shifted decisively to Piedmont Bridge Capital. A special board meeting was called for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning. Attendance was mandatory for all named executives. Grant walked into that conference room on the 41st floor believing, right up until the final 10 seconds, that he could talk his way through it. He had talked his way through worse rooms before. He straightened his cufflinks in the elevator mirror, the same way he had the morning he fired Devon, an old habit, a tell he didn't know he had. The room was different than he remembered it. The long table had been cleared of the usual clutter of tablets and coffee cups. Rebecca Winslow sat at one end with a closed folder in front of her. Bernice Calloway sat near the middle, unusually still, her hands folded so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale. Marcus Doyle sat across from her, reviewing a printed copy of the recapitalization agreement, as though searching for an emergency exit clause that might not exist. And at the far end of the table, in a plain gray blazer that had clearly been chosen with more care than it appeared to have been, sat the intern Grant had fired 3 weeks earlier. The room did not move. Nobody spoke. The overhead lights hummed the way they always did, but somehow in that exact silence, everyone in the room heard it for the first time. Grant's mouth opened and then closed again, the practiced authority draining out of his face in real time, like watching a tide pull back from a shoreline it would not return to. Somewhere behind him, a chair leg scraped against the floor as one of his newly appointed board members shifted, unable to sit still, under the weight of what was clearly about to happen. Nobody offered Grant a chair. Nobody offered him coffee, the way they always had before every meeting he'd ever walked into in this building. The silence stretched long enough that the ventilation system, usually invisible, became the loudest thing in the room. A low mechanical breath filling a space where 6 confident careers used to sit. "What is this?" Grant finally managed. "This is a board meeting," Rebecca said evenly, "called under the governance provisions of your recapitalization agreement. Mr. Ashworth is the controlling beneficiary of Piedmont Bridge Capital's stake in this company. He has been since before he applied for your internship program. Grant's eyes moved to Devon, and something in his face cycled through disbelief, then calculation, then a version of anger that had nowhere left to go. You're a child. I'm 19, Devon said, and I read a spreadsheet correctly, which is apparently rarer around here than I realized. Marcus set the recapitalization agreement down slowly, staring at Devon like he was trying to reconcile two different people occupying the same face. You planned this? No, Devon said, and for the first time since he'd sat down, something sharp moved under his calm. I planned to understand what my family's money was funding. You planned to fire a teenager rather than tell the truth to your own board. Those aren't the same kind of plan. Grant's jaw worked, searching for footing that had already disappeared beneath him. Those termination numbers were a normal part of restructuring. Every company in this industry does workforce optimization. You're going to blow up 140 jobs over a rounding argument. I'm not blowing up anything, Devon said. You are. You've been doing it quietly for 3 years, one wave at a time, and calling it optimization so nobody had to look too closely. I just made it impossible to keep not looking. Rebecca opened her folder. Before we proceed to findings, I want the record to reflect something Mr. Halloway may not be aware of. 2 days after Mr. Ashworth's termination, his personnel file was altered. She turned to Bernice, whose face had gone the specific white of someone watching their own execution, scheduled in real time. Ms. Calloway added a fabricated disciplinary note, backdated 3 weeks, describing a verbal altercation that multiple witnesses, including Ms. Nadella, under sworn statement, confirm never occurred. The system's version history places the edit at 11:07 in the morning, 17 minutes after Mr. Ashworth was escorted from the building. Bernice's voice came out thin. I was documenting a pattern of behavior, making sure the file reflected a lie, Rebecca said, without raising her voice at all. That's falsification of employment records to justify a retaliatory termination. It is, on its own, sufficient grounds for immediate dismissal for cause, and it is very likely the least of your legal exposure this morning. This is insane, Bernice said, and her composure finally cracked down the middle, the polished HR cadence giving way to something raw and cornered. I have been at this company for 11 years. 11 years, and you're going to end it over a formatting note? You altered a legal document to manufacture cause for a retaliatory firing, Rebecca said. Still perfectly level, and you did it fast enough that I have to assume you'd done something close to it before. I'd be careful about how many times you use the word insane in a room with a court reporter's transcript running. Bernice's hands, folded so tightly in her lap, began to tremble. She looked, for one unguarded second, directly at Devon, as if searching his face for the mercy she had never once extended to anyone she'd walked out of this building. She found none there, only the same flat, patient attention he'd shown Grant on the day she'd typed his fabricated warning into the system. She said nothing else. Rebecca turned next to Marcus. Mr. Doyle. The investigation confirms you were aware. The retention figures presented to the board excluded terminated employees in a way that materially misrepresented company performance. When Mr. Ashworth raised the discrepancy, you did not correct the record. Instead, witnesses confirm you advised Mr. Halloway to remove him from the room rather than address the accuracy concern. Those figures were technically accurate under the parameters we'd established, Marcus said, and even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded coming out of his own mouth. Parameters designed specifically to exclude the terminations that would have made the number honest, Rebecca said. That is not a parameter. That is a decision to mislead this board and 2 representatives of your controlling investor. Your conduct is a direct violation of your fiduciary duty. Mr. Doyle. The board finds sufficient cause for immediate termination, effective this morning. Security will collect your credentials on your way out. Marcus nodded once, slowly, the fight visibly leaving him. He did not argue. He gathered the printed agreement in front of him, tucked it under his arm as though it still belonged to him, and said nothing further. Then Rebecca closed the folder and looked, for the first time, directly at Grant. The room seemed to draw a single breath and hold it. Grant's confident posture, the one that had filled boardrooms for a decade, had gone somewhere. Devon couldn't quite name, not fear exactly, not yet, but the first cold edge of a man watching the floor disappear beneath a life he'd assumed was permanent. Grant Halloway, Rebecca said, founder and chief executive officer. The investigation has established, with documentary and witness support, the following. First, that you terminated Mr. Ashworth in direct retaliation for his refusal to falsify financial data presented to this board. Second, that in the days following, you pressured Nadella to alter her own supervisory notes regarding Mr. Ashworth's performance in order to retroactively justify the termination, a request she refused on the record, twice. Third, that upon learning of this governance review, you removed 2 independent board members specifically because they had voted to cooperate with it, replacing them with executives who report directly to you. In a clear act of obstruction, Grant found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. You have no idea what it takes to run a company like this. None of you do. You think numbers on a spreadsheet tell the whole story. I built this from a warehouses in Gastonia with 11 employees. I made the hard calls nobody else in this room was willing to make. The hard call, Devon said quietly, was firing a teenager instead of telling the truth to the people whose money kept your company standing. That's not hard. That's just cheap. It just took people 3 years to notice. Grant's hands came down flat on the table, hard enough that the water glasses near the center jumped. Do you have any idea what I sacrificed for this company? I missed my daughter's high school graduation for a supplier crisis in Memphis. I mortgaged my own house twice to make payroll, the year we lost the Baxter contract. And you're going to sit there in a $19 blazer and tell me I'm cheap? I'm telling you that none of that gives you the right to lie to a room full of people trusting you with their money, Devon said. Sacrifice doesn't buy you a pass on honesty. If anything, it should have made the lie feel worse, not easier. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Rebecca let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to, the way a good auditor lets a guilty answer finish hanging in the air before she writes it down. Grant turned on him, something raw, finally breaking through the polish. You have no idea what you're doing, Devon. Owning a piece of a company is nothing like running one. These people in this building, they don't respect you. They're scared of what your money can do to them. That's not the same thing, and you're about to find that out the hard way. You might be right, Devon said, and there was no triumph in his voice at all, only a kind of tired steadiness that made the room feel colder. Running a company is different from owning a piece of it. That's exactly why I'm not doing this alone. I'm keeping the people who actually know how this place runs, the ones you spent 3 years quietly getting rid of, because their names didn't look good on a headcount slide. You think Priya Nadella can hold this company together? You think the floor staff you're so eager to protect understands strategic planning? I think, Devon said, you're about to find out what happens when people aren't afraid to tell the truth anymore. The same people you called replaceable are the ones who've been keeping this company running while you were busy protecting your own authority. My grandmother worked a factory floor for 31 years. Every single manager who ever called her replaceable was wrong, every time, and every one of those factories eventually needed her more than she needed them. I learned that lesson a long time before I learned how to read a balance sheet. Rebecca was already opening her laptop, typing without looking up. The board finds sufficient cause for immediate termination. Grant Halloway is removed as Chief Executive Officer and from all management positions within Halstead Meridian Group, effective immediately. Security has been notified. You have 30 minutes to collect personal items. Grant stood slowly, and for the first time since Devon had known him. Since that first morning on the 41st floor, when Grant had looked at him like something beneath notice, he looked genuinely, completely defeated. Not performing it, not managing it for the room, simply defeated. "This isn't over," he said, but the words had none of the weight they used to carry. "You can vote me out of this room, Devon, but you can't run a 140-person company like a school project. Reality doesn't care how much money your uncle left you." "Then I'll deal with reality when it gets here," Devon said, standing to face him at his full, unremarkable height. No taller than Grant, nothing physically imposing about him at all, and somehow it didn't matter in the slightest. "I'll deal with it with people who don't think lying to their own investors is just part of doing business." Grant walked toward the door, then stopped, his hand on the frame, and looked back one final time. "You really think you won something in here today?" "I think the people this company spent 3 years quietly discarding won something today," Devon said. "I just made it possible." Grant left without another word. Marcus followed, a moment later, his expression carefully arranged into nothing at all. Bernice was last, gathering her things with hands that still hadn't stopped shaking, muttering something about lawyers to no one in particular as she reached the door. Through the glass walls of the conference room, employees on the open floor watched, frozen mid-motion, as security quietly escorted 3 former executives down the same corridor where Grant had once pointed a 19-year-old toward the elevators with a smug, satisfied smile. Each of them carried a small cardboard box. Nobody on that floor said a word. Somewhere near the reception desk, a phone rang twice and stopped, and even that small sound seemed too loud for the moment. Rebecca closed her laptop. "I'll handle the transition paperwork this week. The executive team will need immediate interim replacements." Devon nodded. "Priya can put together recommendations. She knows who's actually been holding this place up while everyone else was busy protecting their own numbers." Through the glass, he watched the elevator doors close behind Grant Halloway, and for a moment neither of them, the boy who'd been fired, nor the man who'd fired him, said anything at all. 6 months passed. Halstead Meridian Group did not become a different company overnight. There was no press release, no dramatic rebrand, no photo of Devon Ashworth smiling behind a new nameplate. What changed instead was quieter, and it took root the way real change usually does. Slowly, in small decisions nobody outside the building would ever read about. Priya Nadella became interim chief operating officer within 3 weeks of that Thursday morning. And within 4 months, the board made it permanent. She rebuilt the retention reporting process from the ground up, this time with every termination counted. Every wave of layoffs disclosed in full to the board, without exception. And a policy, written into the employee handbook in plain, unambiguous language, guaranteeing that no employee could be terminated within 30 days of raising a documented concern about financial accuracy without an independent review first. Without independent, 41 of the 51 employees terminated the previous quarter were offered their positions back, with full back pay and a formal written apology from the company. 33 accepted. Odessa Ashworth, when Devon told her the number, said only, "That's 33 families who get to sleep a little easier," and went back to stirring whatever was on the stove. Though Devon noticed she wiped at her eyes with the back of her wrist before she turned around. Devon never took the CEO title. He didn't want it, and he was honest enough with himself and with Piedmont Bridge to say so out loud in front of the whole board. Instead, once the transition stabilized, he finished the last 3 weeks of his original internship, badge and all, reporting to Priya like everyone else, sitting in the same open-floor seat he'd sat in the morning, Grant fired him. Because Priya had looked at him after the board meeting and said, simply, "You've still got 3 weeks left, don't you? Be here at 8. He kept his grandmother's cracked employee badge clipped inside his backpack the entire time, the way he always had. Nobody on the floor ever asked him about it. A few people, over those final 3 weeks, noticed him touch the outside pocket of his bag before difficult meetings, a small, unconscious gesture, like checking that something was still there. Grant Halloway was never criminally charged. The board's findings, combined with a quiet settlement negotiated by his own attorneys, kept the matter out of court and largely out of the local business press, though word moved through Charlotte's tight professional circles the way word always does. He resurfaced 8 months later as a strategic advisor for a small logistics startup 2 counties over, a title with considerably less authority than the one he'd lost, and considerably fewer people willing to take his calls. Marcus Doyle left the state entirely, taking a compliance role at a firm in Ohio that, according to Priya, had absolutely no idea what it had just hired. Bernice Calloway's case moved into formal litigation over the falsified personnel record. The outcome, as of the following spring, was still pending, though the version history logs Rebecca had pulled were, by every account, close to unimpeachable. On a Friday afternoon in late autumn, 7 months after the board meeting that ended Grant Halloway's career, Devon stood near the window on the 41st floor, watching the light change over the Charlotte skyline the same way it had the morning everything started. Priya found him there, holding 2 coffees, and handed him one without a word. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd just let the number go through?" she asked. 91%. Nobody would have known. Devon turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands, thinking about his grandmother's voice in a kitchen in Winston-Salem. 31 years of factory work, compressed into a single sentence she'd told him 1,000 times before bed. "My grandmother used to say, the day somebody tells you your voice doesn't matter is the day you find out exactly how much it does." He looked out at the skyline, at the small, ordinary Friday afternoon movement of a city that had no idea what had almost happened 41 floors above it. "I think I'd have spent the rest of my life knowing I let it go through anyway." That's a worse number than 74%. Priya didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They stood there a moment longer, 2 coffees cooling in the autumn light, in a company that had finally, imperfectly, quietly, become something closer to what it had always claimed to be. Maybe Grant had been right about one thing all those months ago. Maybe respect really did have to be earned, floor by floor, decision by decision, long after the dramatic part of the story was over. But at least now, on the 41st floor of a building on South Tryon Street, people could tell the truth about a number without packing a cardboard box for it. And somewhere in Winston-Salem, an 81-year-old woman kept a folded newspaper clipping about none of this in a kitchen drawer. Because none of it had ever made the papers, and never needed to. Because the only person she'd ever needed to prove anything to already knew. If this story reached something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognize someone in it, maybe even yourself, leave it a like so it finds the people who need to hear it. Share it with someone who's ever been made to feel replaceable for telling the truth. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been in that room? On which side of the table? I read every single one.